Hello. This sermon audio is a ministry of the Town Church in Fort Collins, Colorado. If you would like to learn more about us, how to connect, or how to support us, go to our website, thetownchurch.org. While listening to the Bible preached is a healthy part of our spiritual formation, it is not the whole picture. So if you aren't a part of a local church, we encourage you to prayerfully commit to a local body of believers where you live. We're glad you can join us, and we hope God uses the following sermon to reveal more of His glory to you.
Grab your Bibles and turn to Mark chapter 4. We are finishing Mark chapter 4 this morning. I just want to give you a little bit of a warning. My voice may go, and at that point, I'm going to call Steve to come up and finish my sermon for me. Got it? All right. Mark chapter 4, we're going to be looking at verse 35 this morning. 35 and on. We've been working through a series in the book of Mark, seeing Jesus as we go. So that's what we've been doing. Mark chapter 4. If you don't have a Bible, there should be one in the pew in front of you. I think there are two kinds of fears. All right, and here's what they are. This isn't scientific. I haven't proven this, but I'm just going to tell you what I think they are. Two kinds of fears. I think there's the fear in the unknown. Yeah, all right. And there is the fear in the known. Those are the two kinds of fears that we have. The fear in the unknown seems right, doesn't it? I mean, that seems right. I don't know what's going to happen when that bear actually gets a hold of me and starts to eat me, but I'm sure it's not going to be good, and so you fear that, right? That seems right and natural. But the other kind of fear, the fear of the known, goes something like this. I've experienced this kind of thing before, or at least I know someone who's experienced this kind of thing before, and I know how it's going to end, or at least I think I know how it's going to end, therefore I'm fearful. Right? That's the fear of the known. Those are the two kinds of fears that I think we have. Fear of the unknown and fear of the known. Now, what do both of those kinds of fears have in common? Doubt. Right? Both of those kinds of fears have doubt in common. If you're a believer this morning, if you're one who's following Jesus, both of those fears spring from, at its root, a doubt in who God says He is. I'm just going to put it out there from the very beginning. Our fears spring from a doubt in who God says that He is. Our fears say a lot about what we think about God. Most of Mark chapter 4 so far has been parables. It's been stories from Jesus, his teaching through stories, trying to show us that He has sovereign control over all things. Right? Specifically, He has sovereign control over those who are going to follow Him. We've seen this over and over and over in Mark chapter 4. God is the one who causes the seeds to grow. We've seen that. God is the one who causes the person to desire to follow Jesus. God does that. That's what Jesus is teaching us in these parables. Jesus has been building this case over and over and over again in these short stories or these parables. Now, who is meant to understand these parables? The disciples, right? He's telling these stories, these parables, so that the disciples will know and understand what He's saying. His closest followers should understand these parables and the meanings behind them, that God is in control. Now, in our text this morning, we're going to see if the disciples get it. We're going to see if the disciples truly believe. Do they believe that Jesus is who He says He is, or do they doubt? What we learn from Mark, I think, this morning is that Jesus is fully God, and as fully God must be trusted as fully God. I think that's what we see in these few short verses. This is tested in the face of fears. What we believe about God is tested in the face of fears. And so here's my question from the very beginning this morning. Do our lives show that we believe that Jesus is a God to be trusted? Do our lives show that? Do our lives indicate that? Does He have the power? Does Jesus have the power that can be trusted even above our own power? That's the question that I want to work through. How do we respond in times of uncertainty, in times that could be fearful, when it comes to knowing God? So let's look at the context of what we're about to jump into, and then we'll get to the meat. Look at verse 35. Here's what it says. On that day when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was, and other boats were with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. All right, now that's the context. I'm going to stop it there. You guys don't know what's going to happen, do you? All right, this is exciting. I'm going to stop right there. Here's the context of what we're getting into. Remember, Mark wastes no time, does he? He jumps from one thing to the next. That's why we've called this series the immediate gospel, because Mark is wanting to propel the story along, not giving much detail, because he wants to point to Jesus. And so that's what Mark is doing here. Jesus says, let's go over to the other side of the lake. Let's go. For days I've been surrounded by people who are crowding in around me. Let's go. Let's go. So they leave the beach immediately. They don't pack a lunch, right? They don't set the DVR. They don't do any of that kind of stuff. They left and they took Jesus just as he was, and they get in the boat. They move from the beach to the boat. So these men are now in a boat on the Sea of Galilee. Now let's get this picture, all right? I want us to all kind of put on our imagination caps and get this picture of what this is like. The Sea of Galilee is 13 feet long, all right? It's 8 feet wide. So for comparison, Horsetooth Reservoir is 6.5 miles. I'm sorry, I said feet, didn't I? I was wondering why you guys weren't just in awe of that. All right, here we go. Let's back up. It's the cough medicine. The Sea of Galilee is 13 miles long. There we go. I'll quit right now, all right? By comparison, Horsetooth Reservoir is 6.5 miles long. So you got that in your head. It's 8 miles wide, the Sea of Galilee. So we're not talking about an ocean, right? When we think of sea, we're thinking ocean. The Sea of Galilee is more like a lake. And so these men get out on this large lake. Now, here's the question that's coming to your mind, so I'm going to answer it for you. If this is a large lake, if that's what it is, how are these waves large enough to be breaking into the boat and filling the boat? Glad you asked that question. Here's why. The Sea of Galilee is 700 feet below sea level. All right? 700 feet below sea level. 30 miles to the north of the Sea of Galilee is Mount Hermon, a mountain peak that springs up to about 9,200 feet. All right, so you've got this giant mountain, and then all the way around the Sea of Galilee, you've got mountains and hills, and it's rolling, much like Horsetooth Reservoir on the western side. And so the combination of the cold upper air coming in from that mountain, 9,200 feet, and the warm air rising from 700 feet below sea level often hit and cause quick and violent winds that cause significant storms on the Sea of Galilee. This is something that these men knew about. Right? It happened often. It was an occurrence that just the way this lake sat, it happened often. Now, these men are probably in a fishing boat, right? So don't think Carnival Cruiser. They're in a fishing boat on the water when this storm arises. In 1986, the hull of a fishing boat was discovered in the mud of the shore of the Sea of Galilee. They uncovered it. They date it back to about the time where Jesus was walking. This boat is about 26 feet long. It's about 7 feet wide and about 5 feet deep. All right? Last night I painted this picture real quick for you all. And it's the scale. These boats could hold about 15 people. So we're not talking a giant boat here. right? We'll assume that Jesus is with his disciples. So we'll do some math. That's 13 people in this boat. We don't know. But the boat begins to fill with water. Waves are crashing in over it. Wind is howling. Water is spraying. And here these men are in this boat. Waves rocking this thing back and forth. Water crashing in. The boat is filling. They're trying to escape crowds. And this is what they get, right? They're trying to escape crowds, get to the other side of the lake, and they get this. I don't know about you, but one of my greatest fears in life is being in open bodies of water where I can't see the shore. I don't know what it is. Deadliest Catch and shows like that freak me out because you can't see the shore, right? And so I can swim well enough to save my life, but not if I can't see the shore. There's no safety in that, right? And so maybe you're more man or a woman than I am. All right, maybe that's the case. If you're more woman than I am, I'm glad. For these disciples, though, the fear for them was known and unknown, right? Because they'd experienced this kind of storm before, but in some ways it was unknown because these storms are unknown. They're uncertain. It's uncertain what will happen next. Now, here's what I want us to get to, okay? This is a true story. We hold as a church that the Bible is true. This is a true story. This is not an allegory for your hard times, all right? We're not going to turn this in and ask you, so what is the storm in your life? That may be a good question, but that's not what we're getting at. This boat is real. This storm is real. These are real people with real fears, and this storm is the setting for what's happening, not an allegory for difficult times, but it's an example, isn't it? It's an example of the kinds of fears that we face at times. So I want us to get that picture. It's not an allegory, but it could be an example of the kind of fears that we face from time to time. Now remember, Jesus is in this boat with these men. You remember that? Jesus is in the boat with these men, and what is his response when the storm happens? Let's look. Look at verse 38. Waves are breaking into the boat. The boat was already filling, verse 38. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. Stop. In those short words, in that one sentence, we see the humanity and divinity of Jesus allows him sleep. The humanity and divinity of Jesus collide and allows sleep for Jesus. Now, what do I mean by that? Jesus was in the stern. All right, I had to look that up because I don't know what that means. It's the back of the boat. So if you can imagine, he's maybe tucked in that little section, asleep on what was probably a wadded up sack of fishing nets. Right, not the most comfortable place, but he's asleep in the stern, curled up in this boat. In that, we see the humanity of Jesus, don't we? He's asleep. We see that Jesus is fully man and fully God, but here, fully man, how? He's asleep. He's a man who needs sleep. He's tired. He's pushed himself. He's been tracked down by crowds of people for days and days, and he's traveling. He's tired. He needs rest. He's human. And so we clearly see that Jesus is human in this boat. He's asleep on a curled up pile of fishing nets in the stern of the boat. But we also see that he's divine. How do we see that? He's God. How do we see that? He's asleep. Right? He's asleep. When you're battling anxiety or worry or fear or doubt or something in your life, what's the first thing it affects? Your sleep, usually, right? You toss and you turn and you toss and you turn and you can't go to sleep, and so you get up and you watch the triple episode of MASH, and to be culturally relevant, one, Saved by the Bell, and you do that, right? You can't sleep. You don't sleep through times of anxiety, times of concern, times of worry and fear. We just don't sleep. But Jesus does because he's God. because he's God. And so here we have this raging storm, and Jesus is curled up in a ball in this boat, sleeping on a cushion of what's probably a sack of fishing nets. The humanity and divinity of Jesus allowed for him sleep. The same thing that allows Jesus to sleep, however, is the same thing that causes great fear in the disciples. Look at verse 38 again. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion, and they woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we're perishing?" That's the disciples' response. The humanity and divinity of Jesus colliding allowed for him sleep. The humanity of the disciples caused fear and doubt, didn't it? They wake up and they say, "Teacher, don't you care that we're dying?" Not an absurd thing after everything they've just seen. "Teacher, don't you care that we're dying?" We could talk for hours and hours and hours about the ways that this shows their doubt. Shows their doubt in who Jesus is and says he is. But here's just a few things that we see right off the bat. Their fears show that they doubt that Jesus is the creator and sustainer of the universe. Isn't that what their doubts are showing? Jesus allowed that storm. In fact, I would push that even further and say Jesus caused that storm. Colossians 1:15, we see that, speaking of Jesus, Paul says he is the image of the invisible God. He is the firstborn of all creation, for by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him, and he is before all things, and in him all things hold together, even a storm. In him all things hold together. Jesus created all things, has the power over all things, and in him all things hold together. Jesus, get this, Jesus sunk the Sea of Galilee 700 feet below sea level. Jesus pushed up the mountain 9,200 feet above sea level so that the perfect conditions would happen, that this storm would be caused on this lake at this day. Jesus did that. Their fear, the disciples' fear, show that they doubt Jesus is the creator and sustainer of all things. Their fear also shows that they doubt Jesus' love and care for humanity, especially his followers. We see in 2 Peter that Peter tells us the Lord is patient with us, not wishing that any should perish. And so their question, do you not care that we're perishing? Do you not care that we're dying? They show in that they're doubting who Jesus is and who he says he is. His desire is that no one would perish. Now, I understand he does allow it, doesn't he? He allows death to happen. That's not his desire, but he does allow that to happen. The death of loved ones grieves us, doesn't it? We have a friend in the town church whose young mother passed away this week. Death happens, and Jesus allows that to happen. But the fear of the disciples during the storm shows their doubt in who Jesus is and who he says he is, asking the question, do you not care that we're perishing? Now let's bring this into our own circles. Let's bring this in personally. Let's get out of this lake and bring this in personally. And let me just ask a few questions. Why do you worry? Why do you fear? Our fear and our worry say a lot about our view of God, don't they? You may say, no, I trust God. I trust God. I know he's powerful and sovereign, and I trust him. And my question to me and to us is, do you? Do you then if so, why do we worry? Why do we worry and fear the things that we face in life? Let me be an encouragement. We're not alone. You're not alone in your worry. for years and years and years. We could go all the way back to the beginning of the Bible, the beginning of creation, and see that people's fears have pushed into doubts and pushed them to view God in a different way. In Genesis chapter 3, we see Adam and Eve doubting that God is who he says he is, and so they take the fruit that he said not to take. Move forward a book. In Exodus chapter 3, we see Moses approaching God in this fiery bush. And God says, you're going to go and you're going to be my spokesperson and release these people, my people. And he says, no, not me. I'm not that guy. Right? We've got the next several books in that line, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. They just retell those stories. They retell the stories of the doubt of the people. And then we get to Joshua. We get to the book of Joshua. And 5 times in 9 verses, God says to Joshua, do not fear, be courageous. Why does he tell him that? Because he knows what history's done, right? He knows that that's going to happen. He says, Joshua, don't fear, be courageous. But from my perspective, as we look at the Bible, the most raw and real way that we see people doubting God is in the Psalms, especially the Psalms of David. You get to Psalms like Psalm 13, and we see David saying things like this: how long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I take counsel in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all the day? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? 4 times over and over and over, David says, how long? Will this go on forever, God? How long? It seems like you're hiding your face from me. How long? The sorrow I'm experiencing seems to be going on, and there's no change. It seems from my perspective that you're allowing my enemies to prevail over me. How long are you going to allow this to happen? That's brutal honesty, isn't it? Brutal honesty in the Psalms from David. Just like the disciples in the boat. Don't you care? Don't you care, God, that we're perishing? But in brutal honesty, what's revealed? Doubt. Right? Doubt is revealed even among godly men like David and Joshua and Moses. Doubt is revealed in their lives. Even in the hand-chosen group of people that Jesus said, come and follow me, doubt is revealed. How often are we in that same category? How often do we find something troubling, find something that worries us, something that causes us worry, anxiety, and our thoughts of God begin to shift? How often? Why, God? How could you do this? How could you allow this to happen? Don't you care? Don't you care at all? How long will you allow this? I remember when we first found out about the neurological issues of our 4th son, Solomon. We had just moved to Fort Collins. We were here alone. We didn't know a soul. We had left a comfortable setting, comfort with no worries, really. And we moved here. And in our pride, I should say in my pride, I probably thought, I'm seeking God's will, right? Everything's going to go right because I'm coming here to plant this church and things are going to go well and God's on my side and this is all going to work out, right? God, you want this to happen, God. And so that's good and right. And here I go. And then to find out that our son had a life-threatening issue with his brain that would require trip after trip after trip to Denver Children's Hospital, to try to figure out what was going on with these seizures that he was having. All of that, I'm thinking, no, this isn't who God is. And although I never said it, I know that I thought these kinds of things. Why? How could you allow this? How could you allow this to happen? Don't you care? Have you all experienced that? Times in life where you have no clue what's going on, and it brings fear, deep worry, deep anxiety, and your thoughts of God begin to shift. Your thoughts of who God says he is shift. Maybe that's where you are right now. Maybe you've battled this for quite some time. Can I just communicate this morning the obvious to all of us? Our questioning God in these kinds of ways communicates a great deal about what we truly believe about God. For me during this time, it was me communicating that I was the most important figure in his kingdom. That's what I was communicating. For me at this time, it was me communicating to God, Solomon is the most important figure in your kingdom, and so you've got to set this right. And I'm communicating these kinds of things. It was me communicating that God needed to bring his plan in accordance with my plan. This isn't what we set out to do. We didn't set out to have these kinds of troubles. Where are you? Did you take a break? It was me communicating that my world was about me and that I was the king of that world. Have you all been there? Been in a place where things don't go the way you want and there's fear that comes with that. Great fear and worry. And Jesus teaching to crowds of people on a mountain, we've called it the Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew 6, he commands his listener not to worry. That's a command. Don't worry. And then he gives these little pictures. He says, God gives food and clothing to the birds of the air and the flowers of the field. And here's what's implied in that teaching. God cares more for you than birds and flowers. For you to doubt and question is communicating a great deal about your view of God. And then in Matthew chapter 6, verse 33, he says, but seek first your kingdom. Nope, that's not what he says. He says, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. In my fear and in my doubt and in my questioning of God, I was communicating that I was king of his kingdom. No, that's not right, right? This is God's kingdom. His rule, his sovereignty alone is over all things. I am not the king. I'm not the king of this. You are not the king or queen of God's kingdom. Jesus is the king. And in our fear and in our doubt, are we seeking first that kingdom or our own? I think that's a question we should ask ourselves. Whose kingdom are we seeking? Now, I understand that some people just don't get plagued by worry. I understand that some people don't get plagued by fear and anxiety. I get that, all right? And so you've already checked out and you're thinking about somebody else who does, right? And so here, let me just bring it into something that we can all relate with, ways that we all show our doubt about who God says he is. We display our doubt in lots of ways, distrust in Jesus in lots of ways. One of those ways is by pursuing our own desires, going against the will of God in Scripture. We do that all the time, don't we? We get to passages like Ephesians 4:26 that say that you must not be sinfully angry. And you rearrange that in your head and you say, this is a situation where I'm justified in my anger and I'm going to choose to allow myself to be angry in this situation. Now, what are we doing in that? We're rearranging this and we're saying, this is my kingdom and I'm going to pursue my kingdom. And God, you don't care about me. You must not care about me, because if you did care about me, you'd be on my side in justifying my anger. We do that. Now, we don't say those kinds of things, but that's the direction we lean. We look at passages like 1 Thessalonians 4 that say it is God's will for our lives that we should be sexually pure, and we shove that out, right? This is a physical relationship set aside by God as a gift for a man and a woman within the bounds of marriage relationship, and we decide for ourselves, this is a situation where I'm going to make this call. I'm going to make this call and I'm going to do what I want to do. And what are we doing when we do that kind of thing? We're saying, this is my kingdom. And I'm going to pursue my kingdom. God, I doubt that you are who you say you are. This is not your call, this is mine. Do you see how that doubt of God even wiggles in those kinds of ways? So now no one's off the hook. We're all in this together. There are so many ways where we doubt that God is who he says he is, and if left unchecked, here's what happens. It begins to trickle into all ways of our lives. It may begin with a small worry, a small worry about how am I going to pay this medical bill? A small worry about am I going to pass this midterm? A small worry about these little things, and then they begin to trickle into our lives. And before we know it, we're at a place where we're doubting God's power over anything. All right, these little things begin to pick up steam and go into our hearts and minds, and before we know it, we're doubting God's control over everything. Now, you may not know this about me, but I lean toward the sarcastic side. Shocking, right? And sometimes it's even sin. But I think an appropriate question maybe for us as a community, or it could be, when someone's facing this sort of slow trickle into some doubt and worry, a question could be, oh, so are you God, or is God God? Now, I know there's compassionate ways to ask that, and maybe you can think of one. I couldn't. But that's the heart of this discussion, right? We get to a place where we have to ask the question, am I God or is God God? Do you believe that God is who he says he is right now? Maybe that's the question we ask. And so what's the remedy when we wrestle with fear and these things that lead to doubt? Doubting that God is who he says he is. What's a remedy to that? Part of that remedy is seeing Jesus' divine power displayed. Part of that remedy is actually just looking to see how powerful Jesus is. How does Jesus respond to his disciples? Look at verse 39. Look at verse 39. Teacher, do you not care that we're perishing? Verse 39. And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And he said, why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith? Jesus wakes up from the disciples shaking him, and he rebukes. Right? Jesus wakes up and rebukes. We have this rule in our house that our boys are not to get out of their beds until we come to get them in the morning. Right? The house will burn down around them. They will lay in their beds tucked in, right? They cannot get out of beds. That's been a rule from day one. So when I'm laying in bed asleep and one of them standing next to me and wakes me, I awake rebuking. Right? In a very different way than Jesus did. Jesus wakes up, and he's the creator of the storm. Jesus is the God of these disciples, and he rebukes the storm. That's the first thing he does. He rebukes the storm, and he says, peace, be still, stop it. Stop. Cease. And what happens? The storm is overwhelmed by a great calm. I want you to see that. The storm is overwhelmed by a great calm. The great chaos that the disciples were experiencing is overwhelmed by a great calm that Jesus commands. The great chaos that the disciples were experiencing is overwhelmed by the great calm of what Jesus commands. And then what does he do? He rebukes the wind, the storm, and then he rebukes the disciples. And I'm just going to allow these two questions that he asks to convict and challenge us. Here's what he asks. Why are you so afraid? And have you still no faith? Allow those questions to sink into your heart, where you are in your fear. Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith? That's what Jesus says. You're in a boat made of wood from trees that I spoke into existence on a lake that I created. Why are you still afraid? Allow those questions to sink in. Why are you still afraid? Have you still no faith? What's the remedy for our doubting? Part of the remedy is knowing Jesus' divine power. Part of the remedy in our doubting is knowing why we're afraid and then realizing that Jesus is over all things. And so maybe for you, that question needs to stick. Why am I so afraid? Maybe for you, you need to write that question out and just post it all over your house and read that question aloud as you see it. Why am I so afraid? And then you answer it aloud. And I would gather that if you answered that question aloud, you would begin to see that there is something untrue about God in your answer. Why am I so afraid? And you answer, and it's something that's untrue about who God is. And here's what you do when that happens. You confess that as sin. You confess your worry and your doubt that shifted you into thinking differently about God as sin. Confess it to a God who gave his son to pay for it. What's the remedy to our doubting? In part, it's asking for God to give us more faith, isn't it? When we have fear and worry, we ask God for faith. There's this beautiful story in Mark chapter 9. We'll get to it in a few weeks. Mark chapter 9, where this father brings his child to Jesus for healing. And Jesus says, all things are possible for one who believes. That's his response to the father. And Mark goes on to tell us, immediately the father of the child cried out and said, I believe, help my unbelief. And so part of our believing God and not worrying is asking God, help me to unbelieve in the parts where I don't. Help me to believe more and more about you in the areas where I don't believe you are who you say you are. My question for us is, are we doing that? Are we asking God for more faith in those areas? Fighting lies with truth is a remedy to our doubting. And so we see Jesus' divine power, and we see it displayed. Another remedy we find in verse 41, and we're going to finish. I got to be done. Verse 41, here's what Jesus says. I want you to look at this. Or here's what Mark says. And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? Who is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? The disciples were filled with great fear, not the same kind of fear that they had before when the storm was raging, but a fear and awe of who was in their boat. That's how it shifted. A remedy to their fear and doubt was knowing the divine power, knowing that Jesus is who he says he is. A remedy to our known fear is fearing the one we know. You hear that? A remedy to our known fears is fearing the one we know. And that's Jesus, knowing that all things are under his power and authority. We have fears that lead to doubt, and if we're not fighting those fears with the remedy of the truth of Jesus, we have fears that are going to lead to doubt in us thinking in ways that are disconnected from who God really is. So we have fears that are known and unknown. Jesus is who he says he is. And these disciples are learning that. He's loving, he's gracious, he's merciful, he's dealt with me in ways I do not deserve. You know what the psalmist says? David says it's a 6-verse psalm. He asks these 4 questions. How long, O Lord? Are you going to forget me forever? He asks these 4 questions. It's a 6-verse psalm, and here's how he ends that psalm. But I have trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. That's how he ends the psalm of how long. How long. And so here's what we're going to do this morning. We're going to spend some time confessing areas where we've grabbed on so tightly to the things that we want to control. That's what fear and worry is. It's our desire to control the situation. And so we're going to spend some time this morning confessing that control and asking for God to help us change, because we need God's help. We can't do that on our own. And then we're going to rejoice in song, just like this psalm says. We're going to rejoice in song, knowing that God has dealt bountifully with us. He's dealt with us in ways we do not deserve. We're going to sing and rejoice in that. Let me pray for us, and then we'll work into communion. Father, you are a good God. You're a God who loves us and deals with us in ways that we do not deserve. You're a God who is in control of all things. We know that to be true, but we don't act like it's true at times. And we worry, and we want to be the king of the kingdom. And so my prayer for us as we think through these things this morning is that we would not just think of this boat and the storm, but we would think about the areas of our lives where we're questioning your control over all things, your power and your sovereignty over all things, because we're worried. I pray that you'd open the eyes of our hearts to see those areas. That we would not be so proud to think that we do not have areas where we worry. I confess that's the case for me at times. And so God, penetrate our hearts and show us those areas so that we can confess those to you and think rightly about you. We need your help in that. And so do that, we pray. Amen.